I guess we can begin. Um, and I'm Helene Gale, and I'm one of the co-chairs of this vaccine panel. And along with my other co-chair, who you'll hear from for a minute, in a minute, we're really pleased to have both the people who are listening in, the audience and the public, and the presenters who are here today, and really want to just say how much we appreciate people responding to our call to be able to provide information on this important committee on equitable allocation of vaccine for the novel coronavirus. And while we have an incredible committee, and we won't have time to go through and talk about all the committee's backgrounds, but you have that information. We have a really great, diverse committee that represents a whole range of expertise. We couldn't do these studies without having people who have very specialized expertise and particularly specialized roles within the context of this effort. So we really want to just, again, thank all of you for heeding the call and coming to provide your information expertise. We also have a very packed agenda, so we're going to be we're tight on time. We're asking people to keep their comments relatively brief. I think we've asked people to talk from 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how many people are in a particular session. And then there will be opportunities for the panel to engage with you in back and forth question and answer for, again, unfortunately, a brief period of time, given the number of speakers we have and the time allotted. There will be additional time if, in fact, there are additional open questions that we could ask people to either come back for another session or follow up with calls. I also want to thank our sponsors, the NIH and the CDC, for their support of this study. It is incredibly gratifying to have these two agencies working together to support this study because we know that they both have very important and unique roles in this. And so, it's wonderful to see that kind of collaboration. I also just want to remind people that this is a open session, and I think the committee has put on the chat some of the specifics around what that means. But this is an on-the-record information gathering session. The committee is in the process of assembling information, so we are not able to disclose what our deliberations are at this point in time, and we will not be speaking about anything specific that goes on into our committee deliberations, and nothing that we say today should be taken as specific to our deliberations or that they connote any particular conclusion that we have come to. So, the line of inquiry that you may hear is not necessarily indicative of our own conclusions. And obviously, when this report is made public, you will have a clear sense of our recommendations at that time. Because the time today is limited, the public will not be able to engage in discussion and dialogue, but we want you to feel free to submit any questions that you have. And I think the address is listed in the chat box. So we really do want to hear from you. And the committee will have an opportunity to hear from and engage with the public at future meetings. The committee will produce a discussion draft of its report for public comment and hold a public workshop to discuss its recommendations later this summer. So just to put that in context, what we expect for this. So let me turn it over. Maybe first, Victor, I don't know if you have any comments that you'd like to make as introductory, and then to Bill, my co-chair.
No, I don't have anything to expand on except to welcome everyone, and particularly our guests, who's going to bring a lot of information to us. And the committee will certainly want to ask you lots of questions and integrate the thoughts in their deliberation. So thank you.
Bill?
To the panel, you don't know how grateful we are that you're willing to share your experiences and your expertise. As Helene mentioned, this is quite an unusual committee. And together, the committee has a lot of information, but they don't have as much as they would like. And so we're grateful that you would help in this. Those of you who used to watch college football may remember how good the University of Alabama was. But as the team players leave the locker room going to the field, there's a sign that says, "Out of myself and into the team." And that's the way this committee has been. And so we thank you for being willing to be our coaches. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill and Victor. And so let me just ask our first panelist, and you know, obviously everybody who is going to speak today has CVs and resumes that could take up the whole time. So I'm not going to give a lot of in-depth introduction to any of our speakers, but know that you know, these are all folks, and I think you have bios of their eminent and illustrious careers and contributions. So the first one is Moncef Sloy, who is the Chief Advisor for Operation Warp Speed. And we would love to hear from you about understanding the vaccine development and procurement landscape here in the United States as we put that into context for our deliberations. So Moncef.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks for the invitation. I think it's a great thing to be able to have a scientifically and ethically defined framework prior to the stress and pressures of having information about vaccine performance and how to allocate vaccine doses, which are likely to be scarce, at least at the very start of the process post-approval. So it's great that we are able to do this. Thank you very much for organizing it. I'm going to be quite brief and just give you a broad picture about what's the operation and how it's functioning, and then maybe spend some time, as I was asked, to give you a brief summary about the programs, the various vaccines that we have into the portfolio. So the operation in the next slide is really a great team of institutions that are hosted within either the Human and Health Services or the Department of Defense, and you can see their names on the slide, that partner very closely and very tightly with private sector companies that are the sponsors and the owners of the various vaccines that we have selected. On the next slide, our goal in the operation is to deliver up to 300 million doses or immunization regimen to the US population, starting as of January of 2021, or maybe slightly earlier, as the ramp up in the availability of doses will take some time. And we hope to have completed that process by the middle of the year 2021. And the way we achieve this objective is by enabling, accelerating, harmonizing, advising companies, and most importantly, taking most of the financial risk around such accelerated programs to be able to have the vaccines developed and approved, and that in a way that doesn't substitute to the companies' accountability to execute on their programs, and also in a way that does not interfere with the appropriate oversights and regulations that take place. On the next slide, just summarize very quickly the kind of criteria that we have used to select vaccines into the portfolio of vaccines that we are progressing. The first and foremost is good science, I would say, based on facts and data. The second has to do with timing, in the sense that, as I said, our objective through the name actually is to make vaccines available as quickly as possible. And we set ourselves that time frame of having the vaccines available by the end of 2020 or early 2021, which means that they have to be in phase 3 trials as we speak. And you know, there some of them have started already, or at the latest start their phase 3 trial in October or November to be able to be approved and provide protection in the population somewhere towards the middle of the year 2021. That's the latest possible. That created quite a constraint into the kind of vaccines that we could elect into the portfolio. And for that reason, we have selected a number of vaccine platform technologies that we knew or we judged would be able to progress very quickly towards the clinic, but also progress very quickly towards industrial manufacturability to be able to produce the hundreds of millions of doses that we have as an objective to deliver. And we selected 4 platform technologies that are listed here, either messenger RNA or replication defective live vectors or subunit adjuvanted protein-based vaccines or live attenuated replicating vectors for the vaccine. These are platform technologies, some of which are very well established and well understood from all standpoints, and others are less, and I'll come back to that in a second. On the next slide, I put forward what are the key strategies that we are using to accelerate and progress. The first one was to decide to create a portfolio of vaccines to achieve at least 2 things. One is to hedge the risk of failure that, of course, may exist, as we know, with any innovation-based program. But the second is, in case of success of more than one program, that we would be able to accelerate availability of vaccine doses faster than through one program. And secondly, and also to be able to have different product profile, different levels of performance that may be able to address different needs into particular subpopulation. Just to take an extreme example, a vaccine relevant for a pediatric population and a vaccine relevant for an elderly population may not actually need to be the same and have the same benefit risk. Not necessarily. They could, but they don't have necessarily to have them the same. We also elected to run very, very large phase 3 trials for 2 reasons. One, by running very large trials, we're able to accrue more quickly cases that define the endpoint for protection, and therefore we can go faster. But also equally importantly, because these very large trials will allow for a significant understanding of the safety profile of the vaccines, at least over the period where the trials are running, or until the vaccines are approved, if and when they get approved. And that's a very important element to stress. We also decided, as part of taking all the financial risks, to achieve most of the acceleration through deciding to start manufacturing of these vaccines almost around the same time as they enter the clinic, or even before. Because these are using platform technologies, we are able to project what kind of technology would be needed to scale up manufacturing and have a consistent product produced. We actually invested in refurbishing manufacturing facilities, buying equipment, and things like that. And the Department of Defense and its logistical might has been incredibly important in helping us achieve those objectives frankly, in a record timing. The key point here is to say all these approaches are accelerating without avoiding generation of the key scientific data, the key safety data, the key actual efficacy data that are required from any vaccine. And the criteria for approval or non-approval of these vaccines will be the same as those used for any regular vaccine. And with the FDA, we have an agreement for them to review quickly all the data, but totally independently, and make, of course, their own decision, as they would always make them. On the next slide, I take an attempt to describe the vaccines that we have. 6 of the vaccines that we have in the portfolio are now public, as various announcements have been made to announce the partnership that we have made with a number of companies to support them in the research and development of these vaccines, and the manufacturing of these vaccines, and in the procurement of hundreds of millions of doses from the vaccines. For each one of the 4 platform technologies that you see, we elected, as part of hedging the risk, to have 2 different vaccine representative or using that platform technology. With messenger RNA, we have partnered with Moderna and with Pfizer. The non-replicating vectors, we partnered with AstraZeneca and with Janssen's. For the protein adjuvanted vaccines, we partnered with Novavax and with Sanofi GSK. And for the live attenuated replicating vaccine, we are not yet announcing our partner, and we are somewhat earlier in that process. What I try to depict on this slide are the pluses and minuses for each one of the vaccines as we expect them based on our understanding of these platform technologies. And I, for obvious reason, will not specifically discuss the performance of a particular vaccine, but more here. My take on the overall characteristics of the platform technology. So if I look at the RNA platform technology, one of its most important features is actually the speed with which vaccines can be developed here. That's what's remarkable is that the sequence of RNA being generated through combinatorial of 4 different nucleotides is effectively, chemically, the composition of an RNA vaccine against any disease, any infectious pathogen is going to be the same. And the structure of the RNA remains the same. That makes it an incredibly reproducible platform. And that's one of the reasons why the 2 vaccines that are earliest in the development process are RNA-based vaccines. So speed is very, very fast. And efficacy of this platform is very good. We have seen efficacy in terms as measured at this stage only through immune responses induced, whether antibody responses or cell-mediated immunity. In the areas that are less of a potential positive or are a challenge, I would cite cost and capacity, and simply because we are learning to manufacture these vaccines, this platform technology at scale. An important one is the cold chain. Some of these vaccines may require -80 cold chain, so that's very expensive and difficult logistically. Others may require -20 cold chain. And finally, safety. And safety is not because there are any known issues with these vaccines, but simply because these vaccines have not yet been used in large-scale population, and therefore we need to learn more about them. If I take the live non-replicating vectors, speed is also pretty good and efficacy is good. Cost and capacity of manufacturing is an advantage. You can produce hundreds of millions of doses quite quickly. And some of them may have the potential to be a 1-dose vaccine, which in the setting of a pandemic is certainly very important. They also have challenges around the cold chain and also have a lack of experience for large-scale, long-term usage in a human population. The protein adjuvanted vaccines are very well known. They have usually high efficacy. There is very significant human experience, including with adjuvant. They don't have cold chain issues. They just need to be kept at 2 to 8 degrees. They are slower in terms, well, it's all relative. They are maybe a quarter later than the RNA, or maybe 4 months later than the RNA, but usually slower because you have to manufacture the protein yourself versus instruct your cells to manufacture it. And as far as adjuvants are concerned, their safety in pediatric population is not known yet. And again, but of course, their safety otherwise in young adults and elderly is very well understood. And the live attenuated replicating vaccines, if I focus on an important area for them, is a relationship between speed and safety in the sense that the level of attenuation of a live vaccine is always a critical balance between safety and immunogenicity, depending on how much replication is achieved. So that's a little bit, very quickly, I think, a snapshot of what kind of product profile one might expect from the various vaccines that are in our portfolio. And on the next slide, just a few concluding points to say that we are extremely cognizant of the importance of making sure that the vaccines, if and when they become available, are appropriately allocated in the population on the basis of data and availability of those, and on the basis of need nothing else. And in order to document appropriately the performance of the vaccines, we are paying extreme attention to the inclusion in our clinical trials of the diversity of populations that are making up the US population, not only just from a demographic standpoint, but also the diversity of population as is reflected in the morbidity of the disease associated with the COVID-19 disease. Secondly, and that's really an important point, our aim is to develop this vaccine to seek a BLA approval, i.e. full approval by the FDA. No corners are cut on any aspect. If and when efficacy is demonstrated, if the full BLA requirements are not yet met, but are in the process of being met, the FDA on its own, of course, may decide to provide with an emergency use authorization. But in contrast to what people would think, in this instance, the emergency use authorization doesn't represent a curtailed development plan, but rather a point in time in a full-blown development plan. And that's what we're doing. And thirdly, every company that we have elected in the program and in the portfolio has committed to full transparency on data and access to the data, so that there is absolute transparency about the performance and every data that's generated with this vaccine. And finally, as has been announced each time that we entered into an agreement, the US government will be making this vaccine available for free to the US population. Which I believe are all important conditions to have in mind as we are discussing the allocation. I would hope these conditions would not put any impediments to the appropriate allocation or optimal allocation of the vaccine doses in the US population. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dr. Slaoui, and you delivered a lot of information at warp speed. So we'll now open it up to our panelists. I think that we are having some challenges with the chat function, so I think people may need to raise their hands as there are questions, so we can kind of call on people in turn. So yeah, Alta. And you can raise your real hand, or you can go to the participant and raise your virtual hand. But
yeah,
Alta,
I figured out the participant thing. It's a little tricky.
Yeah.
So first, thank you. That was incredibly informative. I wanted to ask specifically about one population, and that's pregnant women, and find out if they're included in the trials, and if they're not, what is the protocol if a non-pregnant woman falls pregnant while on trial?
So pregnant women are not included in the trial. And, of course, the volunteers are made aware that at this stage there is no data on pregnancy. But frankly, I don't have in mind, I can provide the information, so I don't have it immediately in mind. I don't want to say something wrong in terms of what happens if pregnancy happens during the trial. But I mean, obviously, we'll have a very thorough follow-up on that event, but I can't tell you exactly how.
Art?
Thank you very much, Art Reingold. Two very, very short questions. One is, you said that under sort of hoped-for circumstances, there would be 300 million doses by the middle of 2021. Is it your expectation that those would be produced fairly regularly? 50 million become available, 50 million a month, or some other kind of schedule? And then the second question is, given that the U.S. military has been a major sponsor of Operation Warp Speed, do they have a separate allocation of vaccine, and do we need to not worry about allocating where they would fall in the allocation scheme? Thank you.
So yes, the vaccine is being produced, the various vaccines are being produced on an ongoing basis, and we have charts projecting the number of doses that will be available. The ramp up, frankly, starts as of November and then continues accelerating over the months to achieving a very, very large number of doses on a monthly basis towards the second quarter of the year 2021. But that's hypothetical because it assumes 6 vaccines or 7 actually work and the manufacturing goes. We have a risk-adjusted evaluation of the number of vaccine doses that will be available, which still is compatible with being able to, within the first half of 2021, have enough vaccine doses to immunize the US population. But it will all depend on the actual data, right? On the efficacy as we see it. Sorry.
Reed?
On the second question,
sorry.
there's no specific allocation to the Army. So it will be just part of the overall picture.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. Reed?
I really appreciated your comments on the full transparency. Is that the full transparency? Was that full transparency what you're saying in terms of the FDA, or was that transparency also from you guys on your side? And do you see the transparency as being linked to publications, rapid publications in peer-reviewed journals, so that the public will have a chance to look over the shoulder?
All of the above and 100% of it.
Thank you.
Great. Chris? You're on mute. Back on mute.
Okay, it keeps muting me again, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
So Masif, thanks for a great overview and concise addressing most of our questions. And I appreciate the portfolio approach and the risk adjustment for investing in a broad portfolio. My question is, in the event that you're very successful and have more doses than your risk adjusted projections may indicate, or if the use profile is more limited and you have more vaccines than are necessary for the US, has there been any discussion about how the US allocation might be made available to other countries in need? Thanks.
So, I mean, obviously, there's my personal view, and there's these are politically motivated decisions, of course, that will happen at that time. My personal view is absolutely, I am thrilled to know that we may be having a number of doses that are more than we need for various reasons, including potentially because of the profile is such that it's suited to a particular population, and therefore that there will be the possibility to support more globally. I know for a fact that all the companies involved in these have as a policy to make sure that the vaccines will also be made available in those countries where the vaccine trials are conducted, which is, I think, a minimum requirement. And all of those countries are in discussion and having manufacturing capabilities either in the US or outside of the US that will make this vaccine available globally. Secondly, I was pleased on May 15 when the president said that, specifically to a question, that doses will be, if there is more doses, they will be made available outside of the US. But there hasn't been a specific conversation. And frankly, it's difficult to know because we don't know how much vaccine, we don't know their profile. I think these things will happen as the data come out and the reality unfolds.
We're coming close to the end of our time, and in the interest of keeping on time, we have some comments in the chat box as for data requests like the risk-adjusted projections, whether these trials might be stratified by BMI given the impact of obesity. I see we have 2 other questions, and maybe if people could just quickly Assad and Michael, ask your questions, and then Mansef, you can address them both, and then I think we need to wrap up because otherwise we'll be here till midnight with all the other panelists that we have, and we will send you any other questions that come, and with this dialogue, we would love to just keep the lines of communication open. So Saad and Mike.
A quick question.
Oh,
sorry. Yeah. So a quick question. 300 million doses or 300 million individuals? Because some of them are 2-dose schedules.
Yes.
So just
it is courses.
Courses, okay.
Okay, and Mike? Michael.
Real quick, how are efforts proceeding to include nursing home residents and other frail older adults in the trials?
There are requirements on the age distribution in the population and in the trials. And I can tell you that for those trials that are ongoing, it's above 25%, between 25 and 40%. There is also requirements for comorbidities, subjects with the known comorbidities. It's not a stratification, but way over 40% of the recruit. In fact, at this stage, it's more in the above 50% of the subjects enrolled in the trial are having comorbidity and therefore high risk. The endpoints in the trial are disease endpoints. There's of course infection, but we're looking into mild, moderate, and severe disease endpoints. I think it covers all of that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, and really appreciate your all the inputs, and we will continue, I'm sure, to have some opportunities for dialogue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'll be happy to address questions in writing. I'll have to leave the meeting, unfortunately. I have to deal with other things.
Well, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Our next presenter is Ruth Faden, and she is going to talk about ethics and process considerations. And Ruth Faden is a professor of bioethics at the Johns Hopkins University, and will be speaking from the standpoint of bioethics, but also as a member of the WHO SAGE working group on COVID-19 vaccines. So really, again, Ruth is one of these people who comes with long years of experience and an impressive resume that we cannot go into, but really thanks so much, Ruth, for joining us. And maybe you're on mute.
Realize that.
You're back on mute. You're back on mute.
Am I muted now?
No, you're good.
Yay. All right. So I thanked everybody and finished my talk, and we can go on. Right? Not great. But I won't thank anyone again. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. I'm going to whiz through here. If we could just go to the next slide, please. Do I control it? No.
No, they do.
That's what I thought. All right, 4 things I want to touch on. First, I want to situate our WHO working group in the context of everything that's going on in WHO vaccine allocation and distribution discussions. I will spend a little bit of time talking about our values framework that we're developing in the SAGE working group. It is still not, it's still not quite completed, and so I can't quite share it yet. I apologize. A few personal observations I'd like to make, kind of top-level thoughts after having worked on this for some time, and then a sneak preview of an ethics framework coming out from Hopkins on vaccine allocation and priority setting that will be released next week. So the next slide, please. For those of you who are not steeped in the way in which WHO generally deals with making recommendations about immunizations, vaccines, there is something called the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization. It is a 15-member standing committee of the WHO, and its remit is to make recommendations about clinical and public health use of either new vaccines or when an existing vaccine needs to be reconsidered. Their MO is to impanel working groups to advise them that do deep dives into whatever the topic is on which they need to opine if they think they need a working group. And I'm a member of the SAGE working group on COVID-19 vaccines that was impaneled, I guess, in June, maybe May, around a specific issue. There's 26 members of this committee. The committee is divided into 3 subgroups, one on evidence, one on modeling, and one on values framework and prioritization. That's the one that I co-chair with your colleague, Saad Omer. So Saad Omer is doing double duty, triple duty, quadruple duty here. Sonali Kochar, who is also a member of this committee, was a co-chair of our subgroup for a big chunk of time. Next slide, please. So this is to give you some sense of where we fit in the whole process of WHO thinking about vaccines, and also more Broadly, I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the COVAX facility. It's part of something called the ACT Accelerator. It's a global enterprise that was stood up recently intentionally to put a floor under low and middle income countries. It has other goals as well, but that floor is to ensure at least that some vaccine product gets to low and middle income countries. The WHO is using a kind of stylized terminology. Allocation decisions between countries are being, the word allocation is being reserved for decisions about how to divide up vaccine between countries, and prioritization is being reserved as the term for how vaccines should be allocated within countries. The SAGE process is focusing, you see where it is, on policy and candidate evaluation. I apologize for the busy slide, but this is what I could get from WHO. There's a lot of dotted line discussion, however, going on between the policy side and the allocation side, which we can discuss. Next slide, please. In terms of our process, I won't go through the details. We've been agonizing over this framework for over 8 weeks now. It's gone through multiple iterations. It has had feedback from different sources. The process at WHO is that our whole working group will present the values framework for prioritization and allocation, prioritization, I should say there, to the SAGE Standing Committee at the end of August. They will request changes or not, and then approve it, pass it up the chain, and then it will be released as a WHO product along with some other recommendations at a high level. In terms of the structure of our values framework, we have settled on one overarching goal for COVID-19 vaccine globally. We then have 6 principles that we've landed on, 6 values principles, 6 ethics principles, if you like. And those 6 principles have been sort of specified into 11 objectives. And we are now very heavily into the process of iteratively going back between the objectives and priority groups in the abstract, in sort of hypothetical scenarios, because of course, actual prioritization of groups will weight the characteristics of the vaccines that in fact become available early, and supply and the state of the pandemic when all of this happens. So next slide, please. Some high-level observations. I just want to make 4 big points and then maybe have some time for discussion. The first is, and I was very, very pleased to hear Chris's question. I think that even committees, commissions, groups that are charged with providing ethics or values frameworks for the allocation of limited supply of vaccine in the context of this pandemic at the national level, I think it's impossible to address that challenge without thinking about global allocation questions. Just as a matter of integrity, I think it's extremely difficult for an ethics or values framework to have integrity if it looks only internally to the national context. So that is something I just want to underscore. We are also struggling with that at WHO, in our little piece of WHO, I should say. My second big sort of take-home message in all of this is these are obvious to believe all of the members of this committee, and I'm sure many people in the audience as well. This is so beyond health. So whatever values or ethics framework you will be needing to develop, it's one that has to go to all of human well-being. We don't need to rehearse here the many ways in which this pandemic has devastated pretty much every aspect of what makes life go well for so many people all over the world. Having said that, I think it's very important also not to get into the trap of sort of dichotomizing between health and economic or social well-being, public health indicators, and health and economic well-beings. I'm in the school that subscribes to whatever the phrase that so many economists have used over the recent months, which is the first principle of pandemic economics is contain the pandemic. I believe that makes a lot of good sense. I think there's a lot of evidence now to support that view. The hard part comes, I think, in trying to figure out when you have limited vaccine supply and you finally figure out what the characteristics of the vaccine are, how you can use the vaccine to contain the pandemic in ways that are going to most likely improve life overall for everyone, and not only in terms of health. And it may be, right, that the way to do that is by shooting first for reducing severe morbidity and mortality, but that's a conversation, right? Second point I want to make is that we are well beyond distributive justice in this conversation as well. By that I mean that, of course, we're concerned with distributing the benefits and the harms of COVID-19 vaccine, but we have to have that conversation, and we should always have had this conversation in the context of understanding how structural inequities have been exacerbated by the pandemic. They've always been there. Again, we don't need to rehearse it to this group, but it's impossible, I think, to come up with a values framework or an ethics framework for how to distribute or how to allocate limited supplies of COVID-19 vaccine and not engage. And I don't believe this is limited to the US by any means. We are also very much taking this on in the SAGE WHO process as well. Finally, legitimacy is key here. I was heartened to hear that your process will involve what sounds like substantial opportunity for public engagement. Legitimacy needs to be cashed out differently in different contexts. We have to think about the legitimacy at every level of process, but it's a critical question, especially against a backdrop of structural inequities and good justified reasons for distrust on the part of different populations. And let me just give a plug to my colleague, Monica Shock-Spana, who you will be hearing from later, who I think is just about as articulate as anyone on that question. So next slide, that's a great segue to a framework that will be released shortly, I think early next week. It's a collaboration of researchers from Hopkins, and that framework is proposing 3 broad ethical values and 7 ethical principles. So this is a sneak preview at what will come out next week. Next slide, please, to give you a flavor of how that framework develops. It goes from ethical principle to specific goals for instantiating that principle in the context of the pandemic, and how that would link to identifying priority groups. So that's the process for that framework. And with that, I thank you for the chance to speed talk my way through a lot of territory, and I'll stop.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought and very, very useful for our deliberations. And we have about 10 minutes that we could ask any questions from the panel. Do I see a hand raised or? I'm scanning to see.
Alta.
Oh, okay. Alta, go ahead.
Of course, first, boy, Ruth, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much, as well as hearing about all the other work that's going on in parallel with ours. I was wondering, can you just take us back historically speaking and give us a clue about when similar frameworks have used and where they've broken down and why? I mean, trying to make sure we don't repeat the
You mean specific to pandemic vaccines or just generally?
I was thinking more in terms of epidemic or pandemic vaccine. I'll leave it to you to judge.
Well, no, I think it probably is best to narrow the world to that, right? And I think that, first of all, the unprecedented word, which is so overused, and this is unprecedented. So this is unlike anything we've ever faced before. So in that sense, even if we had a great framework before, it probably would not be anywhere near good enough for now. And let me give you a couple of examples. If we look at the framework that was more or less developed for pandemic influenza, sort of various iterations, often what happened is that there's an intuitive set of ethical assumptions being made or ethical values at play, but they're not often made explicit, right? And when that happens, then when the sort of fact situation starts to change or crumble, it gets unclear what to do. So I would suggest from there, right, that it's really, really important. I think where frameworks have fallen down in the past is they haven't been explicit enough about the chain of reasoning and about the generalized criterion that's being used to support a particular priority group, so that if it turns out that the facts of the matter sort of shift, you still understand what the reasoning was. Maybe there's some other group that now fits that criterion better than the group that you had originally thought it was going to work with. Because the epi can change, as we've seen, and also as we heard from the warp speed presentation, we don't know yet which vaccine characteristics are going to come to be the first across, and which vaccines, which characteristics are going to cross the finish line first. So it's really important not to get clarity about what it is, right, that you are thinking is the set of arguments, the reasons why a particular group warrants prioritization. When I made the reference to, and I'll just too quickly go back to the unprecedented part, the two things that I think are whoppingly different relative to other pandemics that we've experienced, that like bioethics has been around to contribute to. One is this dramatic impact on all of human well-being. So while pandemics, what we feared with and worried about with respect to, the big ones that didn't happen with pandemic influenza, even Ebola, of course, was not global. Zika is very singular. We can go down, sort of all the lists. This extraordinary global impact, very different. And so we have to be thinking about vaccines as a tool for overall promotion of human well-being and not merely a tool for public health. It's a little bit of a shift in thinking. And the other is that while structural inequities, profound structural injustices have been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, we're in a moment now where, and I don't need to say this to this group, where the recognition, right, of the extraordinary impact of this pandemic in its exacerbation of those before time structural inequalities, like nothing we've ever experienced before. So I think if we don't rise to the occasion, like if not now, when, right? Are we going to take on as an express responsibility, as difficult as it's going to be, right? How to think through the ethics and values questions in the context, right, of the background conditions that we are experiencing. And this is true globally as well.
And maybe Anna, you have Reed and Jim, I see you're in the queue, but Anna's question is specific to this. So Anna, I don't know if you want to ask your question.
Sure, yeah. I was wondering if you could speak to how these allocation frameworks should address the structural inequities that you're talking about. Is it sufficient to prioritize, for example, by prioritizing essential workers, people with other health conditions, so prioritize groups in which these disadvantaged groups are heavily represented,
yeah.
Or is something else needed?
In my own view, something more is needed, right? But I don't think it's going to be easy. And it may in the end not be prudent, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that when I was talking about legitimacy as a core concern, how are we going to get a legitimate process for making these criteria decisions, these prioritization group decisions? If you say, and I'll just sort of put it out there, if we say, okay, a priority group is going to be low income people of color, and in a context in which there are good reasons for low income or all income people of color to distrust, right? Public health, medicine, the government, right? How does that land, right? And how is it understood? And why should we think that it would be welcome, right? Which is at the same time, and I'm interested to see what Reed especially, because I know he's been thinking hard about these issues, as I'm sure you all has to say here, and how you sort this out in your own work. Helene, of course, as well. And I don't mean to just sort of point to people of color in saying this, but just to say people have been working on these issues for a really, really, really long time. We have, on the one hand, to grapple with the fact that there are good reasons for people, we sometimes use the term justified distrust, right? At the same time, to use that as an excuse not to try to do something about structural inequities in the context of the pandemic is also, I think, wrong. So I'm not ready yet to say there's a clear prescription. I mean, Saad and I have been having these conversations as well in our WHO context, but I don't think to say that there's going to be political backlash is a justification for not trying to figure out a way forward, right? I think it's just something that has to be taken into account, and it may be a failure. It may be wrong-headed, but I think to say we can handle it all by indirection before we think through if there are other options is also a mistake, a moral mistake.
Thank you.
Thanks. Reed?
Great. Ruth, as always, I learned from you. As you went through that, is there an ethical element that we need to dive deeper in that helps to deal with the question of prioritization of reducing transmissibility throughout a population versus protecting those who are at risk because they're older or have pre-existing conditions?
Yeah. So again, a conversation. I mean, I'm smiling, and if we could see Saad right now, I would guess he's smiling too. Because there are so many groups, I think, going through exactly these conversations and trying to think their way through the same conundrums and the same dilemmas. And I'm so glad that this group is taking this on as well. So there's an immediate cop-out, which we could turn to the Operation Warp Speed people to address, which is, look, in the near term, are we going to have any data about the effectiveness of these vaccines in interrupting transmission, right? And odds are, I'm not going to answer that. You have the right experts to ask, but that's the first question. So this is like a chicken way out, but there may be a very near-term practical reason not to go there, right? Because we just won't know enough, right? Now, unlike other parts of the world, in the US, we're set up, if all goes well, to have enough vaccine, to have fair amounts of vaccine not too far from now if all the dominoes fall into place. So it may be that, sooner rather than later, this engaged debate between these two paths will have to be addressed. But in the immediate near term, it's not obvious that it's even a choice, right? Just in terms of the numbers of vaccine doses and what we will or will not know about the capacity to interrupt transmission. After that, I sort of retreat to the big principle, which is if the idea here is, right, that we want to go back to something like a new normal, not the before times normal, but something like normal, right? And vaccines are supposed to be one of the main ways we get there. And again, we don't know what else is going to fall into place over the next couple of months by way of therapeutics and stuff. Then the question becomes so what will get us there sooner? And there is that line of argument that says, look, if this pandemic was not making people horribly sick, right, in terrible ways with really long tails and killing people, we wouldn't have closed down everything, right? So maybe if we can take that fear away, it's enough. The other view is to say no, right? That's not, it's kind of, you'll have Baruch and other people to talk to about kind of how do we break into what might be the best combination of strategies to reassure people that it's okay, because we're not going to get to like zero, it's perfect, maybe ever, right? So that's sort of the reasoning I see, right?
Thank you so much.
Great. And Jim, quick question, last question, because I think we need to move on. People are having heart attacks about the fact that we're running over time already.
Sorry.
I know great
that.
presentation and lots to talk about. So
fortunately, I'll just thank Ruth and say that my question was already raised and answered on structural inequities and how to incorporate them. So thank you.
Hi, Jim.
And there's a lot of comments in the chat box about getting some of the information, and I know that there's timing to some of that, but we hope that we can get some of that information when it is possible. So again, thanks for
my pleasure. I'll listen for as long as I can. I've got a great lineup. Thank you for including me.
Great.
And good luck, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Great. So now we're going to move to our health department perspectives, learning from past experiences and understanding current needs. And we have two great panelists to discuss their perspectives from the state health department viewpoint, both now as they battle with this pandemic, but also based on some of the past experiences that they have had. So we have Kara Kreis, who is the director of Arizona Department of Health Services, who, like everyone, comes with an incredible background and long experience. And my own health department director, Ngozi Ezike, who is the director of the Illinois Department of Public Health, who I rely on a daily basis to keep me and all of my fellow Illinoisans safe. So great to have both of you here with us. And I think, Kara, you're going to start off.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk not only about the COVID-19 experience, but the experience that we had back in 2009 with our H1N1 vaccine distribution. When we look at how COVID-19 is impacting Arizona, Arizona has two large metropolitan areas, the largest being Phoenix, Arizona, but we also have both rural and frontier land as well. And one of the very earliest impacts of COVID-19 was felt in one of our most rural or frontier areas, which was our Navajo Nation. So our tribal partners were significantly impacted early on with a outbreak with some of the highest rates in the country. What we identified in that area was insufficient healthcare, but combined with multi-generational housing and lack of infrastructure. So no running water, no heat. They had to go to the middle of the village, all use the same area to get water, to get firewood. So there wasn't really an ability to isolate because that needed to be done every day. The other impact that we've seen, so that was initially, we had the same kind of first, I would say, peak with that probably other states had. So we did see it in our nursing homes. We saw it in our assisted living facilities, and then in our older population, in addition to our tribe up in the northeast part of the state. As the pandemic has progressed, what we have seen in Arizona has been a shifting down to our 20 to 44-year-olds, but significantly impacting our Hispanic population in Arizona. So we have identified very specific areas in our metropolitan area and along our southern border, which borders with Sonora, Mexico. And we have identified that they have much higher rates. We've got a significant proportion of them being hospitalized because of underlying comorbidities that they have. And then also, even with our stay-at-home orders and the mitigation strategies that we tried to put in place, what we identified was that a lot of these individuals are in positions that were considered essential workers and were unable to not go to work. So that has been a challenge because they haven't been able to take some of the same protective effects that other individuals have. We have noticed that we've got 31 primary care areas, which are smaller areas that have higher rates of comorbidity, and especially among some of our minority population. So we're going to be targeting those areas, especially as it comes to vaccine allocation, social media messaging, and testing to try and get that there. However, what we have been told is that both of those populations, our Hispanic population as well as our African American population, has not had the trust in public health and in the government funded testing sites or those types of things. And so we don't get a great response when we have tried to work with the Centers for Disease Control or HHS to bring out testing sites. And we're hearing that that same issue will be an issue when we go to distribute vaccine. based on our previous experience with vaccine allocation, so initially in 2009, all of the vaccine was going to come to the state health department. We don't have the distribution mechanism to be able to distribute out to primary providers, which is really the way that we allocate our vaccine resources in Arizona. We try to get them out to the bigger providers. However, in 2009, what we were able to do was to automate some of that ordering so that it could be direct shipped directly to our healthcare providers. This made it much easier because we weren't a distribution point. There were a couple of areas, though, that hindered that ability with minimum orders if they were going to be direct shipped to providers, as well as getting what kind of vaccine they needed. So we had this daily routine where the health officers would allocate certain proportions of the vaccine to large healthcare providers to get it out into the community. And at that point, we were also utilizing pharmacies to vaccinate individuals so that people who didn't have access to a healthcare provider could go to a pharmacy. That seemed to work well, but it was a very intensive process because they would have to fill out spreadsheets, get them to us that day. We would upload it into VacMan and then send that day's order out. So getting daily allocations was a challenge, but with our automated process, we were able to get that to be able to work. I think one of the things that we did in H1N1 was that we realized that our Native American population was more significantly impacted with outcomes than some of our other parts of the population. So approximately 2% of Arizona's population is Native American. And we allocated the first 5% of every vaccine order that we got went to our Native American populations. Because they can get healthcare in various ways. They can get it through IHS, they can get it through their own 638s, they can do a fee for service and go to other healthcare providers. Getting that vaccine directly to that population was a little more difficult than we actually anticipated because we thought we could go through the IHS area units to do that. And that we learned as we continued through that pandemic was not the best way to route vaccine to that population. Looking back, though, we are glad that we did prioritize that vaccine, and that seemed to work really well. And with that, I will turn it back over to you guys.
Great, and I think we'll just go directly into Dr. Ezike's presentation, and then we'll have a time for the panel to ask questions. Thanks a lot. And you're still on mute.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you so much, Gail. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what's happening here in the state of Illinois. I wasn't here at the time of H1N1. I was on the provider side of corrections, trying
you're a
to.
bit staticky. I'm not sure if that's just me or.
Sorry, let me turn off the video.
Right, it's a problem here too.
I will turn off the video. See? I told you. No. I lost it.
Yeah, it may be helpful. I'm not sure if you can hear us. It may be helpful if you're not able to do it with your video on to just do it audibly or audio.
Yes. Let me turn off. I'm trying to turn off my camera that we're having. Oh.
No, another alternative is to simply phone in.
Yeah, that's a.
Yeah, we'll provide you a number, and we are trying to turn off your camera. It is currently not actually doing that feature for us at this
Hear me
moment.
now?
Yeah, better.
Okay, I'm using Olu. Sorry about that. I'm having so many.
Great. You're great now.
So I will keep the video off to see if that will help with the bandwidth. Okay. So as I was saying, let me jump right in. So we have obviously for the COVID response, we've had multiple work groups that have been assembled to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Within those work groups, there have obviously been many subgroups. One major, of course, important work group would be the mass vaccination group. And so, of course, there are a lot of emotions around vaccines generally, and it's only heightened now with the COVID-19 vaccine. There's hope. We can't wait for this to come. We hope it's great and it's effective and gives the protection that we're hoping for. There's also panic that, is it getting here too soon? Has it been tested enough? So there's fear, there's anxiety, there's all these feelings. But we want to make sure that in Illinois that we are ready and that we can try to alleviate some of those concerns with lots of education and messaging. So within our mass vaccination group, you can show the next slide, you'll see that we have the subgroups that cover many important areas. So in terms of provider and community education, of course, that focuses on the trainings, the curriculum and educational materials that we will pass out, that we will help both with providers and I would say community education as well. We also want to engage health education training groups that already exist to partner in this important effort. In regards to recruitment, we're going to need additional providers. We need new COVID-19 providers, both for adults. We already have people who probably will continue in terms of pediatric. We need mass vaccination clinics and sites. And so we really want to recruit lots and lots of essential partners in our highly populated, high COVID-19 infected communities, and also those communities that might have minimal access to health services, particularly our rural communities. So as we get our essential partners on board, we'll also need obviously appropriate policy and legislation. And so we know that we will need some expanded scope of practice for some different professional groups. We want to make sure that dentists can participate in this work, potentially hygienists. We want to be able to use medical students and nursing students. Even on the table, we're talking about veterinarians. And so we also have to, of course, work out and make sure that, that these vaccines being given will fall under preventive health services so that, administrative fees can be collected by the providers that are engaged in this effort. With regards to our immunization information system, unfortunately, at the risk of airing some of our laundry here, we have a registry system that is a homegrown system that was developed almost 2 decades ago. And so we've been trying to see if we can get a new system in place. We don't think it wouldn't have been possible to get everything up to speed in time. So we're aggressively working on just upgrading our existing system so that we can, take in provider enrollment, get that data. We're trying to create a new enrollment portal. We're hoping that we can get much better reports with real-time data. Hopefully we can get to paperless scanning of barcodes instead of having data entry. So really trying to see kind of more patchwork essentially until we have, put our current system to bed for good. But since this is what we have, we're just trying to make all the essential bandaging and upgrades that we can so that we can really be able to take on this mass vaccination effort and still be able to turn around important data, to stakeholders and to groups to know where we are at with the effort. As well with data surveillance, we're hoping that we can do those upgrades to be able to get out that important information. We have to be able to see who has been vaccinated and who has not been. Again, we want to be able to accurately identify where we are with our efforts, identify areas that, populations that have not been reached to sufficient numbers, and be able to really have actionable data that can inform our work and help us to target specific areas. Under logistics, again, that's our preparedness team. Our preparedness and response team will be working hand in hand with our emergency management agency to really make sure that we have great ground coordination, and that things get where they need to go in terms of transport, that all the cold chain issues are addressed, and vaccine is transported with minimal loss due to temperature issues, et cetera. And then, of course, under public messaging and engagement, that's a hugely important piece. I'm sure it's been discussed quite a bit in this meeting. We're working, that subgroup is working with the equity work group, of course, to identify the ways that we will be able to counter some of the mistrust. There's general vaccination mistrust, and then there's government mistrust, and we do want to be able to work through the actual myths and try to replace those with facts. So dispelling myths. We know part of this work will involve acknowledging, just frankly head on acknowledging some of the historical events that have led to the mistrust and have led to some of the hesitancy, and be able to assert, things that are in place now that are safeguards to try to prevent, things of that nature from occurring again. I think there's a lot of regular speak that needs to be promoted, as opposed to some of the medical or public health speak. A lot of times, we just say, comorbidities, underlying health conditions, and people are looking at themselves saying, I haven't been to my doctor in years. I haven't been hospitalized in years. Never mind the fact that I've been diagnosed with hypertension or diabetes. So just being able to explain exactly what we mean, so that people who are high risk actually understand that they are, and just being able to put all of our medical and public health speak into less clinical speak, so that we can actually reach the groups that we're trying to reach. We also have to be very intentional about our messaging to immigrant, specifically undocumented populations. There's a lot of fear that, if they try to avail themselves of the vaccine or any of these services, like what kind of repercussions would they face? And so really have to allow people to voice those concerns, and then we have to be able to message, that they can take advantage and are encouraged to take advantage of these important public health interventions for their safety and for the safety, obviously, of the entire community. And then, of course, we all understand that, we don't know exactly how much vaccine will come out at once. And so, in terms of the prioritization, I'm sure that probably has been discussed, but just making sure that we're clear on, the individuals that are necessary for continuity of government, our healthcare workers, our first responders, then our seniors, then again, our long-term care residents, as we've seen how devastating this virus has been to them. We really need to give our long-term care residents, every shot at really being able to overcome this deadly situation. So those are the main subgroups that are working towards this mass vaccination effort. And then in terms of how we will actually get it done, we've learned a lot. Thank you. We've learned a lot from the COVID-19 testing strategies. So, again, maybe a lot of these are not new or novel, but they've just gotten a lot of play in this in COVID world. And so, you know, our drive-through sites, that they have been a major player in terms of people getting tested. And so we are hoping that that will continue to be an effective strategy to even, you know, get vaccines done. Maybe we had these strike teams. We were for long-term care, we were trying to get into as many long-term care facilities as possible. And so we have brought on vendors, private vendors who, you know, supply the staff, and they're, you know, you give them the location and the supplies, and then their teams go in and do the work. And so that has been really helpful. It helped us really get around to, you know, all the long-term care facilities in all regions of the state, you know, utilizing different vendors that specialized in different areas of our very vast, large, you know, spread out state. So, you know, I think strike teams could also be a way that we could think of trying to get groups that are licensed and able to do these vaccines to get into areas that need vaccinations. And I think some of the beauty with these strike teams is that they're nimble. So you know, they don't necessarily go to a place and stay there for 2 or 3 months. It's, you know, here's where you're going to go today, Monday, and here's where you're going to go Tuesday. And then a health department could reach out to the Illinois Department of Public Health and say, oh my gosh, I think we have an outbreak in this high school. Then we can deploy that strike team, you know, specifically to that locale and have all the students, you know, line up to get tested once they've identified the spot that was going to happen. So we really have a lot of flexibility. And so if you have these different strike teams that are going out, as the data comes in, as the useful reports come out, identifying, you know, percentages of vaccination in different parts of the state, then you can identify those those areas of low uptake of the vaccine, and then you can deploy strike teams specifically there and try to get those numbers up. So I think that nimble solution is very helpful. Mobile testing has been such a big win for us as well. And, you know, we've been able to convert, you know, a bunch of different sites into permanent testing sites where people can drive up. You know, we still have to work out what that will look like, you know, as we get into colder months. And, you know, can you do a vaccination, you know, through the window the way, yeah, but I think it's really possible, and we're trying to work out what that will look like. You know, a lot of this.
And just keep in mind, we're running a bit behind, and we want to spend some time with questions. So
okay, last piece, just the tech solutions are super important. We are trying to sign up with a vendor now that will give us a tech solution so that when people want to show up at a mobile testing site right now, that's for the actual COVID testing, they can actually pre-register and they can pre-populate all the fields of their information, you know, and have that ready to go so that things will be much more efficient and much quicker, and it's just a verification process when they show up to the site. So we know that great tech solutions are actually key to making all of these things efficient. So we're hoping to incorporate this into our mass vaccination response. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And both of you, thanks so much. It's great to have kind of the practical on the ground experience as we think about some of these issues and really what goes into getting the vaccine to people. So I think Allison had a question, and then Jim had a question.
Great. And thank you to you both. It's amazing to have sort of news from the other front line on the public health response. I actually think I got my answer on the Illinois side from Director Ezike, but for Director Christ and for Arizona, as you think about this demand creation side or promotion side of things with the hesitancy and the distrust and the misinformation, for your community, what are you most worried about, and what resources do you most need to address demand creation?
So that's a great question. And I think one of the things that we're most worried about, Arizona has a significant anti-vaccination movement that has significant influence with some of our policymakers as well. So I think one, it's going to be the distrust of the vaccine itself. And then if we get past that, then it's the distrust of who's giving the vaccine to some of those populations. We are already starting right now with trying to bring up our flu messaging, our flu vaccine campaign, so that we can roll that into a COVID vaccination campaign. But really what we likely need for the demand, I think we will have sufficient demand besides those populations. The minority populations are going to be a little bit more difficult to get to. But what we've identified is we have some providers that have really good trust with those communities. And so we're working with them to potentially provide mobile services to meet them in their communities. So stakeholder groups like Chicanos por la Causa or Family Tree Medical Center, they have established relationships. And so we'll be using those and not having it be from the health department or from public health or government.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you. My video seems to be blocked by the host, but thank you, both of you. This question is for Dr. Chris, based on the past experience with H1N1. Do you know how closely primary care providers followed the criteria for priority groups when they were providing vaccination to their patients? I ask that because some evidence from the 2004-2005 vaccine shortage indicated that some of the primary care providers were not closely following the priority guidance.
So that's a great question. We don't have a great way of following, so very similar to Illinois. We do have an immunization registry. However, it can be used for adults. It is required for children, but in the adult population, it's very difficult to track who's getting the vaccine and what their underlying conditions were. So we did try to get it out to those priority populations, especially some of those impacted areas like we had identified, but tracking it beyond that was difficult.
I have Reed and then Jewel.
I know we're short on time, so let me just, and maybe we can follow up later. But Dr. Chris, one for you really quickly. I was intrigued by your strategy last time around to make 5% of your doses right off the top available to Native Americans. The question becomes, are there commitments that you and or other colleagues around the country that are in similar positions are already making about the dissemination of the vaccine, or are you waiting to get guidance from committees like ours? And then for Dr. Ezike, your comment around the potential for providers perhaps charging a fee. I wonder if we can get a little more color on your sense of expectations as to whether or not you've been in conversation with your insurance commissioner and whether or not the fees charged by the delivery system will be mitigated by insurance.
Thank you. I can take the first part of the question. So we have a vaccination allocation and distribution task force that is looking at that. Right now, we don't have recommendations and we haven't made any guarantees for how we're going to allocate that vaccine just yet, because we are waiting on recommendations and to identify what the vaccine is going to be, if it's going to require specific doses for specific populations. But yeah, we are interested in hearing what the recommendations are.
Dr. Ezike, insurance commissioner, how much providers will be charging patients to get the vaccine because they think it's free, and it sounds like that there may be costs all of a sudden associated.
Yeah, so for people, like I know for Medicaid, talks are underway with our, that's our HFS, which is our Care and Family Services, who administers the Medicaid program. And so trying to have that, again, we know that will be instrumental in terms of promoting the uptake of giving it and getting people to provide it. I'm sure it's a modest administration fee, but we have to be able to compensate people for the time that they're taking and the time it takes to put the information in the registry. So we're hoping that from these conversations with our Medicaid department that there will be a preventive health services that this could fall under that code designation and people could recoup that associated administration fee.
Thank you.
Jewel, last question.
Thanks. So it's good to see you both. Don't forget to take care of yourselves. If you had to think about what you could most use for program administration to make things simpler for yourselves, if we're thinking about using technologies in any ways, as we've talked about, but then getting out to rural areas, places with limited cell or broadband access, or maybe urban areas where people don't have technology at their fingertips, is there anything that it would be helpful along with vaccine and supplies that communities could be supported with that you would want spoken about?
I would say that we probably have all of the challenges that you just discussed. We have areas that don't have access to broadband. We have areas that don't have access to that technology, the personal level. And so some simple way to quickly register people into a system to get them vaccinated and just quickly move them on their way, whether that would be, a QR code or something that they could print off, they could have on their phone, and it could register and provide the health department with that information, or the provider, I would think, some kind of tech solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Just echoing what Dr. Chris said, absolutely. If there was, an app that people could access via their phone, that could make things easier. I think, that is something that many people have a phone and they're very facile with the different apps. And so that's a way versus having, identified stations in communities where it can be done. And maybe there's some kind of, tech sign up station and at designated locations where people don't have the ability from home, but they know that's, at this gas station or this place, I can go there and do it. So just making it available in centralized locations or having it ready at their fingertips for phone apps.
Thanks.
Great. I see no more specific questions in the chat box, and I think we're about out of time anyway, but this has been wonderful and really very much appreciate both of you coming in and talking with us and spending some time. And, we obviously will depend on our state health departments to be real partners in this effort. So it was great to have you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We could take a 1-minute stretch break for people while we get the next presenters on the line. And we have 3 presenters, and so it's great to have all 3 of them presenting different perspectives on this really important issue that has been touched on in several of the other presentations around ensuring public trust and equity. And so we have Monica, I always mispronounce this, Schockspanner, to present from Johns Hopkins. And she is at the Center for Health Security and co-author of The Public's Role in COVID-19 Vaccination. Steve Wakefield, who just retired from his job as the External Relations Director for the HIV Vaccine Trials Network at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. And then Julie Morita, who is the Executive Vice President of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. But just before that, she was the Commissioner of Public Health for the City of Chicago, so has the perspective both of a health philanthropy, but also as a city health, public health official. So I think, Monica, I think you are first in line, and we will take all of your presentations, and we've asked you to be fairly brief, 5-7 minutes at the outset, And then we're going to engage with you in discussion. And so that's the challenge of having you in a panel. You get less time to talk, but we also then get more time to discuss with you. So Monica, take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. If I could have the next slide. As indicated, I'm going to talk to you in my position as the co-chair of the working group on readying populations for COVID-19 vaccination, which was stood up in April by myself and my co-chair, Dr. Emily Brunson. We're both medical anthropologists. Emily works on vaccine hesitancy, and I work on community role in managing epidemics and disasters. Our purpose in setting up this working group was to bring the best thinking from vaccinology, public health, and social and behavioral science to tackle the question of how could we advance public understanding of access to and acceptance of vaccines that would protect against COVID-19 once those products were available. Next slide, please. I do want to recognize the members of our working group, including Dr. Saad Omer, a member of your committee. Next slide, please. So why did we write the report? So as we know, vaccines can provide relief from the multiple stresses of the pandemic. At the same time, and national polls are bearing this out, many Americans, including those that are most at risk of COVID-19 impacts, may miss out on or opt out on this life-preserving public health measure. From the perspective of the working group, we were also concerned about an unfounded presupposition that seems to be driving Operation Warp Speed, which is basically, if we build it, they will come. And the literature tells us that for a variety of reasons, people may decide or may not have the opportunity to access vaccines. So we believe that this one-sided top-down approach that doesn't take into consideration human factors should be replaced from the perspective of human-centered design, and that vaccination delivery strategies need to be built from the perspective of people on the receiving end of the vaccine. Next slide. So what I want to do very briefly is touch on our major recommendations. And the first was to indicate that we needed to invest both in the biological science and the social science behind COVID-19 vaccines. It's one thing to have a clinically successful vaccine. It also has to be socially acceptable, and there are experts that can help with that. Next slide. Importantly for the consideration of your committee is our recommendation that public health communicators need to use meaningful, relevant, and personal terms. And by so doing, they could help crowd out misinformation. And we argued that we needed to have urgent and ongoing study of attitudes and beliefs about vaccine safety, benefits, and supply using national panel surveys. And that can help inform communication efforts. But having just listened to the importance of the state and local ground truths, I also want to underscore that we recommended rapidly conducted community-based qualitative research, and that would provide genuine opportunities to listen to disproportionately affected, historically underserved communities of color and hear in their own words versus that of pollsters what it is that they believe, hope, and fear about COVID-19 disease and vaccines, and what is affecting their willingness and ability to be vaccinated, and how vaccination fits into their concepts of health and well-being. And then that way we can have the type of dialogue and personally relevant type of communication that could drive uptake. Next slide, please. Thirdly was the importance of earning the public's confidence that allocation and distribution are even-handed. And as has already been touched on by Ruth Faden, issues of transparency and public engagement are going to, those practices can boost public confidence that allocation and dissemination is neither capricious or unjustly weighted in favor of other people. Ideally, if time permitted, we should, as a country, involve ourselves in a national dialogue via regional community consultation panels. Some of the questions that you yourselves are addressing, the feasibility of that is still up in the air. Next slide, please. We also argued that we needed to make vaccination available in safe, familiar, and convenient places. Vaccine hesitancy is not the only issue here. There are issues of cost and convenience, and whether or not people feel safe in the site where they are vaccinated. And we believe that greater community partnerships can inform vaccine delivery strategies that speak to the needs of people who want a safe, familiar, and convenient place to be vaccinated. Next slide, please. Our last major recommendation was that we need to go further in the context of today's racially, politically, socially fragmented society, that we need more robust public accountability systems that could help instill community ownership of vaccines. And in this recommendation, what we envisioned were state-level public oversight committees that could help review and report on the equity and effectiveness of state and local vaccination programs. I'd like to stop there so we can have time for the other panelists and questions from the committee, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much. We'll turn it over to Steve.
And if I can have my slides, I won't worry about being on screen. It's a pleasure to be here and be part of this panel and to speak to you. I have had a lifetime of trying to educate scientists about community and communities about science. Next slide, please. I am happy to say that I come from Chicago, first introduced to vaccines before the HIV epidemic as part of a guerrilla clinic for gay men and doing research on the hepatitis B vaccine, and actually spent most of the early epidemic managing community-based organizations in Chicago while serving on the Board of Health there and having to manage being an advocate, an advisor, and sometimes a provocateur. What I want to tell you, there are two stories from my time there. One is during that time I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. I called my mother and I said, "Mother, I need to know our family history of diabetes." Her response was, "Boy, how could you bring something like that into our family?" 5 months later, I'm fixing my plate at the Thanksgiving feast, and she says, "Boy, you act like you got sugar." I said, "What?" She said, "Well, you know, Cousin Pearl had sugar and lost her leg, and Aunt Lorraine," she just went through a whole family litany around diabetes. You know, that same loving, wonderful mother and my father and I were sitting in a restaurant a few months later, and Lester Holt, who you probably, many of you know from the national news, and Marianne Childers, who were local anchors in Chicago at the time, came over to our table and said, "Hi, my parents were excited to meet TV stars." I tell you that because of some of the other things that I'm going to say, and I hope you will make that connection. Next slide, please. You've already heard about this. I wasn't aware it was going to be part of an earlier presentation. Next slide, please. But I will tell you that I'm retired. This is not what I thought about as retirement activity. but the folks who are working on engaging and building community education around the vaccine studies have, as you look on the left-hand side of that slide, 7 priority populations. And they're trying to have activities targeted for each of those 7 priority populations. I dare you to have a priority eye on your stove when you try to make your dinner for 7 different dishes tonight. Next slide, please. So what we're hoping to do here is learn from the task and plan for success. You're scientists. Scientists speak a different language than the people who are going to be the end users of these vaccines. I refer briefly to a CDC experience I had with something called diffusion of evidence-based intervention. CDC had done all of the research they could to make sure those interventions were appropriate and that they worked to mitigate HIV in communities. The evidence was there. What was missing was the cultural translation. What was missing often was making sure that that evidence was appropriate for the populations that were getting the end product. Next slide, please. Stakeholders all speak a different language. The participants in the studies, the communities where the vaccines will be delivered, industry and government will all have a different way of talking about whatever conclusions you reach as a panel. Next slide, please. Just the next 2 slides, just keep going. Kate McQueen and Ward Kate have provided us with the complexity of looking at research from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. Next slide, please. Click again, please. What I want to talk to you about is that whatever you decide is going to require community ownership at the end of the day in order for it to be effective. Next slide, please. So I will tell you that whatever you're going to do, it's too late. Next slide, please. Because we've moved from community engagement as how we recruit participants to a sense in communities of what does partnership and mobilization look like for those communities. At midnight last night, the Twitter was rife with information about one of the vaccines, who owned it, and how come people wanted to see the paperwork from the company. And they said, since there was taxpayer dollars, they had a right to that information. Next slide, please. So we're in a new communication environment. We have new experts. Many of them look like TV spokesmodels. And we have an entire world that's sitting around saying, I look forward to going back to normal when we get a vaccine. Next slide, please. There is so much information that people cannot digest it all, and people are having new magical thinking about that information. As a matter of fact, 15 years ago, when we were trying to do an educational program out of NIH, we had done a lot of research, and the most outstanding prevalent thing that came up again and again was, I won't take anything created by the federal government, but I'll only take a vaccine if it's been approved by the FDA, but nothing from the federal government. Next slide, please. So the challenge is to do the cultural translation of the scientifically based recommendations that you make, knowing that when you talk about vaccines, teaching your body to recognize and fight invaders, people are going to have different images in their mind of fighting those invaders. And some of those TV spokesmodels are suddenly going to think that they are immunology experts, as if they've had 20 years in a scientific lab, and they can tell you, based on what they read in the hallway just before they came on camera, how the vaccine works and which vaccines are important. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend any more time on the fact that they're not just challenged around their knowledge of immunology. But words like equity and vaccine hesitancy are based on their own personal experiences. That's why I tell you about my family. Next slide, please. So you're going to deliver your results in an environment where we are trying to deal with not only a lifetime of living with racism, but very different responses for people about who should be going to sports events, who should have what to say, and people watching individuals lose their employment over what someone said about any one event or even about COVID in today's world. Next slide, please. So I'm going to encourage you to look at the report that we just heard about, but keep in mind that there are ethnographers and there are anthropologists out there who are also scientists and can act as translators for the information that you're going to provide. And I would say that the rapid response may require engaging pollsters. If we can figure out what's going on in elections, if we can figure out what marketing products does, you may have to put the results out with flexible plans that say, hey, we learned more after we put the plan out, and oops, we're going to change what we're saying. Next slide, please. One of the most important pieces will be to help the public understand that it's not skin color, but what are the factors that really underlie what we know about the vaccine and how it works, and what we still don't know about the vaccine and about its future. Next slide, please. I am really pleased to know that the people in Japan found a simple way to get the message out there. They didn't try to help people understand the science. They talked about closed spaces, crowded places, and closed context settings in a manner that allowed people to have a common dialogue about how to protect themselves. Next slide, please. So I'll just thank you for this opportunity and look forward to participating in the panel.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. And I know you will get some comments and questions and great graphics there. Julie, maybe we'll turn to you.
It's great. Hello, everyone. Steve, I'm sorry that we didn't overlap while you were in Chicago. Sounds like I missed colorful interactions with you. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And as Helene mentioned, I will be presenting to you and sharing my perspectives as the Executive Vice President of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but also as a former health commissioner for the city of Chicago. Next slide, please. I think because of limited time, I want to just jump right in and give you a sense of my recommendations for how to really ensure public trust and equity in the COVID vaccine response. Based on concerns or perspectives that I have, I think it's really essential for the framework to involve collecting, analyzing, and reporting disaggregated data to really ensure that the priority groups are identified and resources to support distribution and administration are really appropriate. Also include the recommendation that those who are most affected in planning and decision-making really need to be included in this process. And then the other recommendation is really establishing a coordinated federal, state, and local system. I think Dr. Christ and Dr. Ezike gave you a sense of what it's like at the state level. The response really needs to be happening at a coordinated level, and I'll go into that a little bit later. And then the last recommendation I have is really leveraging the existing public health immunization infrastructure, because I think that what is in existence actually can allow this to be a more equitable and process, and also to ensure more public trust. Next slide. One of the questions that I received before this panel was to talk about how Robert Wood Johnson's culture of health, the concepts that we have really can be used to inform in ensuring public trust. And so what I want to do is share with you our definition of health equity. Health equity means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. And this requires removing obstacles to health, such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences. including powerlessness and the lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education and housing, safe environments and healthcare. And I think as I go through my slides, I'm hopeful that you'll see the connection between my recommendations and this focus on removing obstacles to health. Next slide. I think as others have talked about already today, it's clear that COVID has really underscored and highlighted the structural inequities that exist that have led to the disproportionate impact on people of color during the COVID pandemic. It is clear. And what has heartened folks at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is that we're hearing people talk about health equity and racial equity in ways that they haven't talked about it in the past. And we see energy and commitment to addressing these inequities. And so what we didn't feel was that people had a great sense of how to operationalize that. What does it mean to operationalize health equity? And so in May, we released some health equity principles for state and local leaders to use in responding to a reopening and recovering from COVID-19. And those principles are actually reflected in the recommendations that I made. The first principle is really collecting and analyzing and reporting disaggregated data. The second is including those most affected in decision-making. The third is establishing and empowering racial equity teams in these planning processes. And then the fourth is identifying and filling policy gaps. And the fifth is investing in public health and social infrastructure. So I think that these are critical elements of how state and local health leaders should be responding and reopening, and I think also contribute to ensuring public trust with this vaccine response. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do now is shift a little bit more toward the perspective of lessons that I've learned from my experience overseeing the H1N1 vaccine response in Chicago in 2009. I think Wordsworth's quote is really quite fitting for this time. There are many lessons we can learn from H1N1 and really apply them to COVID-19. Next slide. My recommendation to focus on having a federal, state, and local coordination is really, really essential. The Centers for Disease Control really did manage that oversight for the H1N1 response. And what they did is they manage coordination between state, territorial, public health agencies. They work with vaccine manufacturers, so there was a clear system for the vaccine to come into and then be allocated appropriately. They also worked really closely with insurance companies to assure that insurance companies covered the cost of vaccine administration, so healthcare providers who received the vaccines and administered them to their patients didn't lose money in the process. And then they also worked closely with vaccine supply manufacturers so that the syringes, the alcohol wipes, the Band-Aids, the sharps containers were all provided to healthcare providers at no cost to them. And so that basically the healthcare providers were able to provide the service without being with reasonable support, so it wasn't a problem for them or a challenge for them. This oversight was also important in terms of the kind of communication that is really necessary. I think to ensure public trust, there has to be focused and clear communication that's consistent. And during H1N1, there was that kind of coordination and consistent messaging that we saw come through. It helped at a local level so that we could be sure that we were saying the same thing as our other counties in the area and as well as the state. And I think that was incredibly helpful as well. Next slide, please. The last recommendation that I have is really for to tap into existing immunization infrastructure. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but there is an extensive infrastructure that is in place. The Vaccines for Children program really serves as the cornerstone for this system. It's an entitlement program that was created after the measles epidemic in 1989, where tens of thousands of people were infected and hundreds died. And the Vaccines for Children program made all routinely recommended vaccines available for uninsured children, Medicaid eligible children, Native American and Alaskan Native children. And this vaccine the system itself really, it exists through state and local health departments and provides vaccine to over 40,000 healthcare providers in the nation. And 83 million doses of vaccine are distributed through this system on an annual basis. So the system really is in existence already. And it's the system that we in Chicago use to ramp up and build upon for our H1N1 response. That VOC program is then enhanced by the 317 program, which helps assure that there's healthcare provider support, vaccine accountability, effectiveness monitoring, the immunization information systems that Dr. Ezike mentioned are supported through this program. And there's a lot of effort that's done to address racial and ethnic disparities in immunization coverage. And the VFC program in and of itself is really helpful in addressing racial and ethnic disparities in childhood vaccines because of the populations that it reaches out to and the network of healthcare providers that are located in communities that can actually reach these populations. And the last arm of this program is really this ability to expand up and out to really enhance outbreak investigation and control activities using vaccines. Next slide. In Chicago, this is the slide shows a map of Chicago, and throughout it demonstrates the different sites where we were able to distribute the vaccine. So building on the Vaccines for Children program and the 317 program, Chicago Department of Public Health was able to enroll more than almost 800 provider sites throughout the city of Chicago to distribute the vaccine in an equitable way. We worked with our childhood providers that were already enrolled and then added adult providers, geriatricians, OB-GYNs, long-term care facilities, jail systems. We really reached out widely and broadly to get the vaccine out to these sites. And on top of that, we also had some mass vaccination clinics scattered throughout the cities, particularly in communities that are traditionally underserved. What was remarkable about those mass vaccination clinics was that when we had these clinics, the clinics on the south and west sides of Chicago, which are predominantly African American and Hispanic, actually had low demand. Demand was just not there. And then in contrast to that, clinics on the north side had lines winding around the building. And so we knew that we weren't necessarily doing what we should be doing in terms of reaching into the community. And so we did partner with community organizations and faith organizations to try to help us to increase the demand. I think we had marginal success in doing that, but we learned a lot of lessons in that process. Next slide, please. So I think one of the reasons I really feel strongly that it's important to build on the existing infrastructure from the state and local levels is not just because of the existing immunization infrastructure, but also because by working with local and state public health as well as CDC, we can tap into the existing capacities that have been strengthened since the last pandemic. I think what we've seen over time, whether it's measles outbreaks, whether it's heat waves, whether it's H1N1 pandemics, these epidemics really just underscore and exacerbate underlying health inequities. And so because of that, a lot of health departments throughout the nation have really been focusing on improving health equity and addressing some of these systemic barriers. And so what I have here that you'll see is Healthy Chicago 2.0, which was a public health improvement plan that Chicago launched in 2016. And the fundamentals, this plan was built on data, really using data that was disaggregated to the community level and to drive and engage community partners. And community partnership was the other key element within this plan, so that we were actually able to engage with community to build the plan as well as to help implement the plan. And these partnerships that we established through the development of this plan really have had long-lasting impact over the course of, well, I shouldn't say long-lasting, but had definite impact over the course of the past few years with Chicago. They are in the process of getting ready to launch their Healthy Chicago 2025, which had much better community engagement in the process of development, and will have additional engagement and partnership as the plan is rolled out. But on top of it, next slide, please. The partnerships that were forged with Healthy Chicago 2.0 and over the past few years really were influential in terms of Chicago's response, racial equity rapid response team that was created to respond to COVID's disproportionate impact on African American and Latino Chicago residents. And what they did is they engaged with the same groups that we engaged through this Healthy Chicago 2.0 planning process to really work toward addressing and preventing this disproportionate impact from being exacerbated. And so they worked on things like education, testing and treatment, prevention and support services. But the key enablers of this initiative was really having contextual and community-specific communication that was possible because it was built on mobilization of community-level organizers and leaderships. So those most affected were really included in the planning process and implementation process. And all of this was based on data-driven investigative work. So you can see where my recommendations come from. They come from experience with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and our focus on health equity. But they also come from my frontline experience in the city of Chicago and seeing how these kinds of things, the work that we've done in terms of engagement of community, using the data, building our systems on existing infrastructure, really have been and can be useful as you move forward with the COVID-19 response. Next slide, please. So I'll just conclude here with my my recommendations again, just so that you can see what they are, and I look forward to answering questions.
Great, thanks. And thanks to all three presenters for quite an interesting range of different perspectives on this topic. So maybe we will entertain questions from the panel. And I think Alta had the first question. And I see you, Art.
Thank you.
Alta.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those were wonderful presentations. And I wanted to ask a question, however, about just the last one, Dr. Morita. It concerns your comment about coordinating federal and state response. So your description of Chicago was very, very detailed. And yet, of course, there are going to be other places, not only cities, but whole states that really have very different demography and challenges. So I guess what I'm wondering is it crucial that you have a single kind of values and principles framework that everybody works from? I understand operationally on the ground, there'll be differences. Or is it possible, or have states actually had completely different frameworks, some focusing more on equity issues as their top priority, others focusing more on prevention of spread, a third one being about protecting most vulnerable, depending upon their own circumstances? Because in a federal system, I'm not sure how much variation we allow or can tolerate.
So I would say that from my past experience at a local public health department, in these times of crisis, whether it's Ebola or whether it's Zika or whether it's H1N1 or COVID, it has been incredibly valuable to have CDC providing general guidance and principles, including, and also language and communications, like what are the core and critical messages that we should all be communicating. And there are subtleties and there's nuances and there's customization to your community. But to have the basics and the fundamentals out there is so incredibly valuable. When I look at what's happened over the past 9 months, I'm not seeing that clear and consistent communication. It's not coming from, it hasn't been coming from CDC, whether it's related to testing or mask wearing or school reopenings. It's a hodgepodge. And I feel like what has happened is that there's been a lot of local jurisdictions or states kind of competing with each other, coming out with their own recommendations. And that is not what we need at this time. What we need is a coordinated response, especially as it comes to resources, a scarce resource like vaccine. When there's a scarce amount of resource, we really need to make sure that it's distributed and allocated equitably, and it's not every man for himself. And without a coordination at a federal level, I think that's what we're going to end up having.
Thank you. Art?
Thanks very much for all of you. I guess my question is also for Dr. Morita. So if I understood correctly, your experience with H1N1 working in the communities, still you were somewhat disappointed with what you were able to achieve in terms of coverage with, and I'm a Chicagoan by birth, so I know the parts of the city you're talking about, and it sounds like it could be some of the traditionally underserved areas where you had the hardest time achieving higher coverage. So I wonder if based on that experience, you have any novel and creative suggestions for COVID. And let me just give you one example. So recently in Oakland, we've had support for a number of years to administer flu vaccine through the Oakland Public Schools. Many countries use school-based immunization. We don't in general in the United States. But when it comes time to vaccinate children, could you see a role for example, school-based immunization?
Right. I think that there's less. We were disappointed with how we did in terms of allocation and turnout, the driving demand from communities of color in the city of Chicago during H1N1. We were disappointed by that. A lot of work has been done since that time to actually engage community better in a more meaningful way, so that we can actually understand from the community what are the concerns, what are the messages that need to be heard? Who are the messengers, the trusted messengers to get that information out? So those are critical things that will move the city of Chicago in a better direction. And Chicago is not alone. A lot of public health departments are working on equity and are working on authentic community engagement. And I am hopeful and believe that they have made progress since 2009. Regarding creative alternative sites, I think schools are really a great opportunity for vaccination sites. Chicago has hundreds of nurses in the Chicago public school systems, and they can provide vaccines. They don't do it routinely. It is a possibility that they could be tapped into. However, Chicago Public Schools just announced this week that they are going to be all virtual this first quarter of the school year. So schools, the buildings themselves might be useful. The school children will not be present in schools. But in other jurisdictions, schools might be a reasonable place to do the vaccinations.
And I don't know, Monica or Steve, if you have anything to add to that. Both of you look like you might have something you wanted to say. Yeah.
Just to add, I do think we need to build out the capacity within the community, and I think we need more novel collaborations among practitioners, community-based groups, and qualitative and quantitative researchers who can work rapidly in such a way that the designs of effective vaccine delivery strategies are possible. And I, a message I think that will be important for your committee is that the implementation of any allocation framework must be built on the capacity of local communities to reach out to those they haven't been able to reach out before.
Thanks.
And the only thing I would add to that is that whatever the systems are, they need to be responsive. They cannot be formulaic. They cannot be ones that we say, well, this was our plan, so this is the only way we're going to do it.
Yeah, thanks. I think all of you highlighted the need for adaptability. Jewel?
I appreciate all of your presentations, and I know we all speak the same language of equity. I also know that not everyone does. So as we go forward with this report, does any of you, and this is not just for Julie, even though you work for a foundation that has spent a lot of time on communication, are there any other ways in which we should be thinking about engaging communities, locals, and states who feel that words like equity, and slide got me thinking about this, is a word they can't even say, much less embrace, because this is a framework question and beyond. Thanks.
I'll be happy to speak to that, Jewel. I really think that equity is an important value, but communicating the value is not necessarily the way to reach the people that we're going to reach. I'm remembering that the Houston Health Department at one point gave away tickets to a concert of popular singers as a way to get people to do HIV testing and to reach, quote unquote, hard to reach people. We can't tell people they're hard to reach. We can't tell them that we don't know how to reach you. What we have to do is be creative and then use existing systems. And in one neighborhood, it may be the schools. In another neighborhood, it may be the fire department. And in yet another neighborhood, it may be the churches. One of the really important places to look are to some of the smaller churches that don't have health nurses on board, but also to get them to work with these mega churches that have full health departments that could be working. So I think the challenge is going to be with equity is to be responsive, just as we're going to have to be when there are outbreaks of the epidemic, in a manner that allows us to move in and utilize whatever infrastructure we find works for a geographic area or an age group.
So Jewel, I think I heard a different question in your question in terms of how, and actually I had to pause. I'm so glad that Steve answered the question because it gave me a moment to think of what words we use Because in the past 6 months, we've actually gotten so comfortable talking about health equity and race equity. They've almost forgotten how we talked about it before when we were trying to use words that weren't equity. And what the foundation has actually used often has been opportunity. That in places where you can't say equity and have people really understand or want to hear you talk, you can sometimes talk about opportunity. How is it that we make sure that everyone has an opportunity for access to vaccine, has the opportunity to participate in the planning process? So rather than use the word equitable, I think opportunity might be a word that is used in a way in reaching across to those who may not feel comfortable saying equity or understanding what that actually means.
And just to build on that, from research based on the Zika outbreak response in a focus group, an individual who came to the outbreak from a more religious perspective was willing to incur a greater burden of a particular public health intervention on behalf of the least, the last, and the lost. And I think that we really do need to find a variety of framings for a core concept as equity, much like Julie was saying. For some, it may be opportunity. For others, there could be a faith tradition that brings people to the table that we should definitely be genuinely listening to.
Thank you. Reed, I'll let you have the last question.
Real quick one for Monica. You really talked about a recommendation of communicating in meaningful terms. Is the field of communication in this space far enough along now that we can just reference best practices? I mean, obviously our committee do everything. We've got to deal with this issue. So will we be able to sink our anchor into a solid bedrock?
We are in a situation that is, as Ruth said, unprecedented, as others have said. I think that we really do need new, rapid, substantive response done on from a thematics perspective. We have best practices around partnering with community groups in order to customize and amplify communications. I just don't think we have the core messages that we need in the COVID-19 case under the current political polarization and the social fragmentation. I think the content really needs to be empirically based, and we need to get out there and start doing the research.
Okay, I know they're going to gavel me, but let me make sure then, given the short time that we have, we can't invent that.
Right.
So I guess it may be that we will have to revert to principles. So I hope that at some point offline, you can work with us a bit to give us at least a sense of principles that we might be able to communicate.
Great, I'm happy to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks all three of you for great presentations, and we hope that your door is open as we have continued questions around this very important topic. So thank you very much. All right. We're going to move to our last panel of the day. It is 5:30 on a Friday afternoon. So your charge is to make modeling as riveting as possible. So this is our session on modeling for vaccine scenarios. And we're pleased to have two experts in the field. And I think, for us really thinking about how to think about modeling in the context of vaccine prioritization, what data are out there, how can modeling be useful. So we're pleased to have Professor Mark Lipschitz from the Department of Epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and Ali Mokdad, who is the Chief Strategy Officer, Population Health at the University of Washington, and a professor of health metrics science in the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation at the School of Medicine. So pleased to have both of you with us, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentations and then having an opportunity to engage with you in some dialogue.
Thank you very much, and I will try to be riveting, and I will use the hour and day as an excuse for my slightly informal outfit today. Thanks for having me. I'm going to present initially work that's in progress with this group of collaborators shown on the first slide, and then I'll close with some more broad comments. So we have focused on the issue of age prioritization, and that's what I'm going to talk about. There are many other ways to prioritize, and I'll comment a little bit at the end on some of those. Next slide, please. So we've been, that just says by age, so we're trying to use models. Thank you. And we're using SEIR models, which in the old days I would have explained, but now everybody's an expert on SEIR models. They're mathematical models that compartmentalize people into different categories as to whether they have been infected or not or recovered. And we are parameterizing these by age and with matrices representing the amount of contact that different age groups have with one another, which varies by country. And we are going to focus on Belgium. Apologies that that's not the United States, but this is the country for which we have the best data available when we did this work, which is still being done, and we will, of course, extend it. But I think the results are sufficiently robust that the qualitative answers will not change. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at is a model in which individuals are transmitting. An epidemic moves through the population, and with vaccines there is some trajectory in different age groups. And you can see that certain age groups tend to peak later than others because they play less role in transmission, and we'll see that in a little while. And with a vaccine in the bottom half, we can change the trajectory and reduce the number of deaths and the number of infections with relatively few vaccines, although obviously better by more vaccines. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. So initially, just to understand the notion, the idea is we have a limited number of vaccines potentially, and what would be the impact of giving those vaccines to different age groups, children, young adults, adults, elderly, or evenly across all ages, depending on how many vaccines we have. Next slide, please. And the answer is that it depends on what you're trying to do. And perhaps not surprisingly, with a highly effective vaccine that's equally effective for everyone, if your target is to minimize deaths, then the best age group to give it to if you have a limited supply is the elderly, because they are the most likely to die if they get infected. No surprise there. But if your target is to minimize cumulative incidence, then it's a more complicated question. The differences are smaller, as you see on the right. And in fact, giving the vaccines to young adults, if we believe the contact patterns are greatest among young adults, as they seem to be in Belgium and in many other places, is modestly more effective in reducing total transmission. Next slide. So what if we relax some of those assumptions? Because we certainly can't expect for certain that this will be the same, these vaccines will be equally good in all ages. Next slide, please. And can you click once more? Sorry, the animation is not perfect. So imagine instead of having a vaccine that's labeled baseline above on the left, that we have a vaccine that has some reduction in efficacy for the elderly, say starting at age 50, my age. It starts to get less effective as you get older. And compare that against a baseline, against a vaccine that's effective, fully effective in all ages. Then what you see is that comparing the dashed lines to the solid lines, with this particular vaccine that declines to 50% effective in the 80-year-olds, it's actually still best. You get the most bang for your buck in terms of reducing deaths by by vaccinating the elderly, but it's not very different. It's not too different from if you vaccinate other age groups. Next slide, please. And we can ask, what is the tipping point? Sorry for this busy slide, but if you think about the vaccine starting to decline in efficacy at a certain age and then reaching some lower efficacy in the 80-year-olds, we can ask, where's the tipping point at which it becomes no longer most useful to vaccinate the elderly? And what's pretty striking about this is that actually almost all the time, if you're trying to reduce deaths and you have a small number of vaccines, 15 or 25% of the population, then it's usually best to vaccinate the elderly, even if it's far less effective in them. But if it's really much less effective in them and starts going down at an earlier age, then there are some cases where, in fact, it's better to vaccinate other groups. Next slide, please. And then the last approach that we took was to incorporate seroprevalence. So this is asking the question, what if we had antibody data that allowed us to vaccinate those who were seronegative and only gave the vaccines to those who were seronegative? And at some point, there was a question of whether the vaccine would only be tested in seronegatives. I think that's not happening now, but it was considered. Next slide, please. So the idea there is if you have 3 vaccines and you can vaccinate 3 people, without serologic tests, you would just vaccinate 3 people chosen from the group that you want to vaccinate. Next click, please. But if not, but if you did have serologic tests, you could vaccinate only those who were seronegative and use the vaccine, the extra vaccine on some other seronegative. Next, please. Next slide, please. And at least at the current level, or the level that was measured in June in Belgium, where seroprevalence was relatively low, this makes little difference. There's not much effect on the outcome, and it's costly and probably doesn't do much. Next slide, please. Of course, it could do more with greater seroprevalence. So that's where we've gotten to. The summary is simply that if you're trying to reduce cases, you vaccinate the transmitters. If you're trying to reduce deaths, you vaccinate those at greatest risk of deaths. Those are unsurprising conclusions. What was surprising to me was that it's quite robust, even, for example, when the vaccine is less effective in the elderly. And that's mainly because the herd immunity strategy from the vaccine, the strategy of trying to stop transmission, really isn't that effective with small quantities of vaccine. It requires relatively large quantities, at which point the prioritization becomes less of an issue. Next slide, please. What do we need from trials to make these decisions based on evidence? I'm actually quite worried that we are going to lack, to some degree, both. The first thing, evidence about efficacy in groups vulnerable to severe outcomes, such as the elderly. The subgroup analyses are going to be underpowered. And also evidence about efficacy in reducing infection and/or infectiousness. We haven't explicitly modeled a vaccine that purely prevents you from dying or prevents you from having severe symptoms. But it's quite clear that those vaccines do not create herd immunity. Such a vaccine would not create herd immunity, and therefore the transmission effects would not be appropriate to think about. Next slide, please. So we need that from trials. We're trying to expand this work. It just got started about a month ago, and we're expanding along various dimensions. Next slide, please. And this is the team once again. And then I just want to, next slide, please. I want to talk about 3 additional considerations. Next. The first is one of the dimensions on which you asked our opinions was prioritizing by race and ethnicity. This is a modeling informed but not a modeling based comment, and it may be controversial, and I look forward to discussing it. It's obviously tempting to prioritize those groups at highest risk of infection and bad consequences, which in this country are the same groups largely by race ethnicity. But I want to point out that first, this is potentially inefficient because if herd immunity has built up within disadvantaged communities, by the time of vaccine availability, they may no longer be high-risk communities for infection. That's measurable, and it depends on whether herd immunity is building up from natural infection, but it's a serious possibility, which means that we would give more doses potentially to those who are already immune, thereby reducing the arguments per dose, or the benefits per dose. And I think all of these arguments are complex depending on assumptions about the degree of natural immunity. But my advice for all that you've paid for it, worth at least what you've paid for it, is that it would be wise to avoid potentially divisive decisions whose effects are actually quite uncertain in terms of maximizing public health. Next slide, please. On the international allocation question, I want to suggest keeping it simple, and two bad ideas that have been that I've heard proposed are first the idea of allocating by need, measured by R of T or caseloads or some other quantitative measures. I think that is impractical because it ignores delays of months potentially between allocation and delivery when we're talking about the global between country allocation. It's gameable, meaning you can manipulate these measures to match whatever the criteria are. And it even provides perverse incentives on epidemic control and reporting, namely to have an out of control epidemic at the time of the vaccine decision. The second idea that I would advise against that I've heard proposed is prioritizing healthcare workers and allocating by the number of healthcare workers per country. This would further penalize those countries most at risk with fewer healthcare workers per capita, thereby getting them fewer vaccines per capita. And it also mistakes the reason for allocating to healthcare workers. The values of healthcare workers are, of course, proportional to how many people they serve, which means that the countries with fewest are the ones for which those healthcare workers are most valuable per capita. So I would actually advocate allocating by, if this was the decision, allocating by total population, not healthcare worker population. And then the last slide is to bring to your attention a part of the literature that I was totally unaware of, because most of it is in the operations research journals, which I do not read, and I don't recommend anyone read if they don't have to. But it is tempting to think about equity across countries as a desirable goal. And for reasons I won't get into for a lack of time, it actually is a counterproductive goal to, if you have two countries with 100 million people in each country, to give the same number of vaccines to each of them. You save more cases by putting them all in one country. Sorry, Margaret. Apologies for that comment. It's counterproductive in the sense that the marginal value of each vaccine increases with the number as you approach the herd immunity threshold. So there is a strong trade-off between equity and efficiency in between population allocations. And I recommend these papers. I think that's my last slide. Next slide, just to see. Next slide. Yes. So thank you, and sorry for the speed.
No, great. That was great, and you definitely passed the riveting test. It was quite interesting, and I think we'll just go to Ali next, and then there are already lots of questions or questioners in the chat box. I think we'll have a good discussion. Ali.
So thank you. Thank you for having me. Next slide, please. Our origin of our model started by our university medical centers asking us to model for their surge capacity. Next slide, please. And we are able to provide daily deaths, total deaths, and hospitalization needs in terms of beds, ICU, and ventilators. And we're using a lot of several variables in our models that I will discuss briefly as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. So we have the third version right now of our model. We started by what we call curve fit that predicted the first peak. Didn't do a good job as the decline wasn't symmetric in the United States like what we have seen in other countries. And then we moved to a curve fit and SEIR, and now we're doing a random knot combination spline and SEIR. In our models, we're using mask use, mobility. We have data on mobility from 4 sources. We see a strong association with COVID, with pneumonia seasonality. We're using testing per capita, population density, particulate matter 2.5, smoking, altitude, and pneumonia death rate. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Everybody knows what we have noticed right now. Every country in the world imposed mandates within like a couple of weeks, sometimes in March, and we have 6 mandates that we follow here and we use in our models as we predict COVID-19, and these are the 6. And as you can see here, every country, almost every country in the world imposed these mandates in March. That explains sometimes the variation in cases because the seeding was much lower in countries that imposed too early, gave them a false sense of security, unfortunately, when they opened up because they haven't seen COVID-19 and it started peaking again. Next slide. We have mobility data. I'm going to go through these slides. I want to add them here to show you what data we have in case you need to use some of these data. Next slide, please. We have mask use in the United States, about 55% right now with all the evidence for masks. And what we are noticing right now, if you look at Florida, Texas, and California, and Nevada, and Arizona, when cases peak, because it is all over the media, then people start wearing their mask, unfortunately. So it's a response to the event rather than before the event in order to prevent the spread of the virus. Next slide, please. We have testing per 100,000 in the US, and there is a huge variation right now between state. Next slide, please. We have R, and I totally agree that we shouldn't base vaccination based on effective R that we keep monitoring here in our modeling, but also we have percent infected in every state, that our model can tell you what's the percentage of seropositive in each of the states based on the data we have, and we validate that. I'll show you. Next slide, please. This is a validation, except for one place in Spain. All the surveys that have been done about seropositive, we've done a good job in our modeling to estimate what's the prevalence of seropositive in every state and in every location. Next slide, please. This is for the United States. We released these numbers yesterday. Our projections now to December 1st is 295,000 deaths. With masks, they could go down by 66,000. We're assuming here that 22 states will impose mandate between now and December, social distancing mandate. If not, that mortality will be around 391,000 deaths projected until December 1st. Next slide, please. We have this for every country in the world. Next slide, please. We have all of these for every country in the world. We have it by age, by sex, and I will show you. We're looking right now to do it by race, ethnicity in the US, by US county as well. And we have several scenarios that we are providing. One is if we keep business as usual, easing our mandates, that's the 391,000. Current prediction, it means that once we reach 8 deaths per million per day in a state, they will reimpose the social distancing mandate. And one is universal mask use, which is 95% of people based on what we see in Singapore and some countries in Asia, that's possible to get to 95% wearing masks, and then we provide that scenario. Next slide, please. So briefly, what we're seeing right now, in many countries, we are seeing another reporting of COVID-19 deaths, and to lesser extent in the US, but it's present, and we see it. There is underreporting. There is excess mortality that we see associated with COVID-19 that's not been reported. We need random surveys of antibodies prevalence in order to make sure how much many people have been infected. And then what we are doing right now, that people are modifying their behavior based on the risk increasing in the community and responding to it rather than preemptively doing it. And that's a concern for us if people are refusing to go and take the vaccine unless the cases and deaths at that time is very high. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at is to evaluate excess mortality here and in other countries in the world, make sure that every country will do antibody surveys every month so we know what's happening between now and the time that we are having a vaccine to help everybody with the allocation. And then countries could implement universal mask mandates, of course, in order to reduce the pandemic until we have a vaccine ready to be distributed. Next slide, please. The challenge for you here is balancing economy and saving lives. So are we going to save lives or livelihood or both, which of course we're all going for both here. So we are providing right now some scenarios for countries. What happens when we call it pulse? If you shut down for 2 weeks and open for 4 weeks, what happens? And we're doing different scenarios for different countries. If you open the airport and there is certain importation coming to your country, what will happen? And then the important part for you here is we've been asked to model certain businesses being closed in a micro simulation. So let's say we close bars and we're having masks, what will happen? And that become very relevant for you. If we vaccinate this segment of the population or this age group, what will happen to the spread of the virus and who will give a priority in order to maximize the impact of reducing the spread of the virus here as we do this. All of you know that we do the global burden of disease, so we have many of the risk factors questions that came throughout the sessions. Obesity, for example, at the state level. We're doing now burden of disease at the county level, but we won't have the data in time for the vaccines here. And the last thing I want to tell you, when I was at CDC, I was the director of the behavior risk factor surveillance system at that time. And we had a flu shortage in 2004, 2005. So we added a question at CDC to monitor the uptake of the vaccine at that time. And CDC put a recommendation. All of us remember that 65 and older will take it. Those who are younger and healthier will delay the flu vaccine at that time. And CDC put an MMWR with these guidelines. Because I was able to monitor the uptake of the vaccine at the county level, providing the leadership at CDC, what's the vaccine uptake. CDC came in December, and at that time, Dr. Julia Gerberdine came and said, we have enough vaccine for everybody to go and take the vaccine. And that's in response to Chris Elias' question. I urge you to monitor the uptake of the vaccine, to know at one point of time that you have enough vaccines, that some of these vaccines could be even better allocated within the states, but also to other countries, as Chris mentioned. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to both of you for great presentations and a lot of food for thought, as we look at how these different scenarios and models can be helpful as we think about our allocation challenge. So we do have questions. I think Allison was the first person who had had a hand raised, and we can take the slides off, whoever is handling the slides.
Great. My question's for Mark. Nice to see you, Mark. I was intrigued by your operations research conclusions around equity and efficiency trade-offs between countries. Wondering if you think that's something we should consider as we think about within country between state allocations, if they're states of similar size, but we could get one state to herd immunity based on, for example, their prior infections. Is that something we should be thinking about?
That's a fascinating question. I don't have an answer yet, but it's something we've been thinking about. The work that's been done is largely with totally disconnected populations, and obviously there's a continuum, and we have not yet looked into that, but that's an interesting question of how much back and forth you would need before that no longer makes sense to do. But of course, the amount of back and forth is also in our control, given that states are closing themselves off to some extent. So thank you for the suggestion.
Michael?
Wow, that was riveting from both of you. Question for both Mark and Ali. Prefacing this, that I think I think we all know the accuracy of the data coming out of nursing homes is still not what we'd like it to be. I really appreciate the excess mortality question. I think the data on assisted livings and group homes is even worse. And then we add in multi-generational families. So knowing that 80% approximately of deaths are in over 65, and the largest proportion of those are in all those settings, I'm really curious about modeling vaccinating nursing home staff, assisted living staff, group home staff, multi-generational families and what you guys are looking at in regards to those.
I can go quickly first, and then Mark, sorry, Mark. We have here at, remember, the most deaths occurred in Seattle when we started modeling in our nursing homes here. So we have done modeling for the nursing home, King County, Snohomish County, which is north of King County where Seattle is, with and without the nursing homes. So we have the capacity to do that if the data is available. Unfortunately, in many states, the data for excess mortality has not been released by CDC on time. If we have access to that data, we can compare it to past years, and we could get a good sense of excess mortality at the local level by age, by sex, by race. Mark, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it has a lot of intuitive appeal, as does vaccinating nursing home residents preferentially, even within their age groups, if the vaccine it does something for those people. So it comes back to my 2 points. I think vaccinating staff works if it stops infection, and is potentially even counterproductive if it purely suppresses symptoms and makes people less easy to identify as carriers. Let's hope it's not just that. But we really need some way of ascertaining that, and I've heard different things about how good the trials are going to be at answering that question. I think it depends on how carefully the people who contract SARS-CoV-2 in the trials are followed and how quickly they're found, which is an operational question. But I am significantly concerned that at the end of this, we will have an answer on efficacy against disease and a big question mark on efficacy against infection and infectiousness.
Thanks. David.
Thank you. First, both thank you, Ali and Mark. Really interesting presentations and important. I guess my question in some ways follows up Michael's and more sort of a request, since we don't have the answer to that, and we obviously won't for a while, what the impact of the vaccine will be on transmission, but it seems like it would be worth modeling that, both around nursing home staff, but then taking that beyond that, hospital staff, and both occupational groups where there's high risk of exposure and multi-generational families. If there's any way you could turn out some basic models saying, if the vaccine is different, different success rates in terms of stopping transmission, what would the impact be? And it would be good to know that now rather than wait till we find the numbers at the end. So if there's any way to do that, I think it'd be really great.
Answer, this is doable from we have a micro simulation that we have used because we've been asked by different countries and locations to do these micro simulations. So we can tweak our modeling and say if it's that much effective in that age group, what will happen to the transmission? How many will be seropositive? Doable from a modeling standpoint. We can have these multiple scenarios and run it as well. Mark, sorry again.
Yeah, I think it's certainly worth asking the question. And I was responding into a texted question from Ana Diaz-Rue, but which goes along the same line, but with ethnic prioritization. I think all of these things are going to have tipping points at which one effect outweighs the other, and we should try to identify what those are now while we have time to model, and then we should try to stimulate data that will answer them.
Right, because it really will help drive the data if we have those tipping points. I think that would encourage the people collecting data to try together.
Yep.
Margaret, you had a question for Mark, and Mark, I think if you could speak up just a little bit, because I think some people are having.
Sorry, is this better?
Yep, that's much better. Thanks.
So my question is for Mark about the dimensions of uncertainty. Of course, we are being asked to come up with a prioritization scheme in an environment of great uncertainty. So that's the beauty of a model such as yours. You can address uncertainty. My question, for your model, what type of time horizon did you use? So for example, you could imagine if I took a long enough time horizon, I would want to vaccinate the spreaders to minimize deaths. If I had enough vaccine, I would do something different. So I was just wondering if you've given any thought to both time horizon one might consider and fraction of the population you could vaccinate, and sort of related to that, efficacy, and how those three dimensions might affect whether it's most beneficial to vaccinate the elderly or when.
Yeah, I think that will be the 58-page supplementary material of our paper.
I just want to keep you busy.
Just to see if I can be more boring than operations research paper. No, just so I think
the
question.
Haters.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So I think the question is a very good one. We have started with the most obvious thing to us, which was to look at the whole course of an epidemic in in a virgin population, which of course is an idealization and not where we are, and certainly not where we will be. And I think the general thing which we've known from flu and others is if you have a poor efficacy vaccine or not very much of it, then you better go for direct protection because that's all you can get. You can't get herd immunity. You can't substantially reduce transmission with a little bit of a bad vaccine. And as you get more, then the herd immunity option gets more and more attractive. And also, as you point out, in the longer term. So I think those will be the qualitative results, but trying to quantitate them is on our to-do list.
Thank you.
Saad.
Yeah, thanks for the presentations. I have a couple of quick questions from Mark. The first one is, any thoughts about an age threshold for the impact on mortality and severe disease? What is a reasonable age cutoff? The second one is very useful for you to sort of provide some perspective on potential sort of differential prioritization by socio-demographic groups. Have you seen sort of evidence so far that it's the herd immunity beyond a certain geographic plus socio-demographic clusters is approaching that level, or as estimated, or sort of estimated, I guess is the word, by seroprevalence, that it would, these kinds of dynamics would start kicking in, and how is that different from age-based? So some of the age-based age groups that are, if impacted differentially, couldn't we say that they would stop being an issue at a certain age, at a certain point?
Yeah, thank you. Those are both really good points. In respect to the first one about thresholds for age, I don't know. It's quite a steep increase, and I think I'm not sure where you would draw a threshold. It's just, I would sort of, if the vaccine was equally good in everyone, I would just start from the oldest person in the country and go down until you run out of vaccine with a small quantity. In terms of whether any demographic group has reached herd immunity or close to the herd immunity threshold for that group, I don't have good data. I don't know if anybody has good data, or I should say I'm not aware of good data. But the sort of impressionistically, the data from New York City on pregnant women delivering babies and their virus prevalence of up to almost 25% among the Bronx and I think southern Brooklyn and southern Queens suggests to me that there are certainly pockets of individuals who are, or populations, subpopulations that are at high levels of seroprevalence, assuming that seroprevalence is real, and that's the other thing is what is immunity, and we all know that's a complicated question. I think you're absolutely right about the age issue, and that the same criticism could be made to age. I think it's, and that's actually where we got started. We wrote a number of papers about using that factor, that that phenomenon to understand who the transmitters are by age, and pertussis and flu. So I think it should be true by age, but I think that the differences by socioeconomics and especially race ethnicity in seroprevalence, at least in the New York State, for example, are so dramatic that they might even outweigh the age. But I think your point is well taken.
So can I add something very quick about herd immunity? Right now, we're seeing in many countries. We were in a call today with Brazilian colleagues. You see a level of sometimes 15 to 20% seropositive, well-done surveys, and you see a decline in infections, and you can't explain it. Why 20% is resulting in a herd immunity at this lower level? In Pakistan, exactly the same right now. And there's so many theories about that. So one of it for this herd immunity that is a little bit misleading at this stage, at a lower level of seropositive for COVID-19, is you have a small circle that infection went to, so people have died, and the people who are super spreader, like your pharmacist, your guy who has a market that is more likely to spread the virus, either became immune because they got to be seropositive or they have died. So the circulation will be reduced at a lower level, but we cannot, if this should be true in New York City, we're seeing in other countries in the world, but we should be very careful that that lower level of herd immunity will be misleading for a short time until the circulation of the virus across that circle or that village where it started and move to the next one.
Thanks, Ali. And Anna, you had a question related to some of the comments around vaccination in some of the high prevalence populations. Did you want to ask that?
Yeah. I think it's been answered already. Thanks.
Okay, great. Alta?
Sorry, I thought, okay. I thought I was just going to put it in the chat. I didn't think we had time. But
no, we can take, we have about 3 more questions. I think we'll take all of those, so go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry. Mark, when you were modeling risk of death, were you looking only at medical factors like comorbidities and age, or were you also looking at situational factors like somebody who's in a population that typically doesn't have access to good health care or typically doesn't have good nutrition?
We were just looking at age initially. I mean, there are many ways to make this better, but we were starting with age.
No, it wasn't a criticism. Just wanted to understand how to interpret it.
Yep.
Michael, and then Art.
Oh, yeah, I just had the question of what kind of modeling you're doing on the prison populations.
Haven't done anything.
Ali, are you doing anything?
No, we're taking the data from mortality from everywhere it comes and infection from everywhere it comes. We're not stratifying or looking specifically at prisons.
Thanks. Art.
Mark, well, my colleagues have asked a couple of my questions, so I'll just make 2 quick observations and then ask a question. The observations are another good reason not to read the operations literature is it's completely blind to real world politics. And so something that might be true in the pages of an academic journal probably don't translate very well into the real world for various reasons. Secondly, unless there's clear evidence that a vaccine is dangerous in seropositive people, the likelihood we would be serologically testing people to decide whom to vaccinate is pretty much out of the question at a practical level, if you ask me. But my question is, when people talked about HIV vaccines, and that might be only 40 or 50% effective, they worried about whether risk profiles might increase if people thought they were protected, and that you could actually increase infections by giving a partially effective vaccine and having risk behaviors change. I wonder if you've modeled that.
Have not, yeah, I think it's a hypothetical question at the moment. I think there are more pressing problems to model, but I think it's not an implausible thing to have happen.
Thank you.
But that's a very good point, because we have seen it right now with COVID-19 in the US. When we peaked and we started coming down, people let down their guard. So if you're going to give them a full sense of security that you're immune from a vaccine, of course they're going to change their behavior, and then infections will increase.
Great. I don't see any further questions in the chat, so I think we can release you both, and thank you very much. I think you stood the test of keeping us awake and interested as the last session for the afternoon, so thanks so much. And I just want to thank our other panelists. I think we've covered a lot of the questions that we had for our full group of panelists, and so we will continue to move on. Also want to thank the audience participants. I think when we started, we had something like 1,000+ participants. That's dropped off a little bit over the course of the time, but I think that definitely demonstrates the interest in this. We want to remind members of the public that any material that you wish to share with the committee can be sent to COVID vaccine framework at nas.edu. That will all be publicly accessible, so make sure that if you send it, you don't mind that everybody knows what it is, but that's important that we get any additional information that the public wants to share with us. So I think with that, we will adjourn this open session. And again, thanks. I know all of our panelists aren't still with us, but it really made a big difference for us to hear directly from this broad range of experts as we continue our deliberation. So really thank you for coming, and particularly at the, with a day or two notice to be able to present to us such high quality presentations. So thanks so much. And we will adjourn, and we'll see the rest of you back in our closed session.